Right, we're on the last part of the eukaryotes lecture. We're continuing on in our survey of the different kingdoms of eukaryotes. We've talked about the fungi very briefly. We're going to now very briefly talk about the kingdom Protista. The kingdom Protista contains all of those unicellular or single-celled organisms that are eukaryotes. So these are organisms that in their entire life they are only ever one cell, and yet they are eukaryotes. They contain all of the characteristics we normally associate with eukaryotes. And there are two subkingdoms to the kingdom Protista. There's the subkingdom Algae and the subkingdom Protozoa. Protozoa literally means first animal. And it contains all of the different groups such as amoeba, euglena, paramecium, etc. Now let's talk very briefly about the algae. Algae are what are called autotrophs, which means self-feeding, which is just a way of saying that they have the ability to manufacture their own food instead of getting their food from somebody else in the environment. They are photosynthetic, which means they have the ability to take energy from the sun and use that energy in order to manufacture molecules of glucose, and that's what they feed themselves, that glucose. There are lots of examples of algae. If you've ever heard of plankton in the ocean, such as what you see here, that plankton is primarily, though not exclusively, but primarily algae. As far as algae goes, there's really not very many that are pathogenic or disease-causing in humans. There is one exception to that. There is a certain species of diatoms. Diatoms are a type of algae that have a very pretty silica-based house or wall that they live within, and they look like they live inside glass houses, which in fact they do. They're very beautiful, as you can see in this picture. There's this one type of diatom that is responsible for something called the red tide in areas along coastlines, such as in Florida, along the Florida coast. There are times of the year when they have what are called red tides, and that's when this particular type of diatom is in large concentration. They have a population explosion at that time. Why do we care? Well, because this particular type of diatom manufactures a poison. And that poison is a neurotoxin. It damages our neurons or our nerve cells in our body, and it can actually be deadly. The way that humans would get it primarily is that shellfish like clams or mollusks like mussels, etc., will actually consume the diatoms, and then if the humans consume or eat the mollusk or the clam that's eaten the diatoms, the humans will be exposed to the poison from the diatoms. Okay, and that's about the only pathogenic algae that we're going to talk about. We're going to move on now and talk about the protozoa, or first animals. These are the single-celled eukaryotes that are heterotrophs. Again, we learned that word when we were talking about the fungi. Heterotroph simply means they get their food from somewhere else in the environment. They do not make their own food. They get their food from other sources. Protozoa are interesting in that when times get bad, such as when a pond dries up, the protozoa in that pond can insist, which simply means they form a very tough coating around themselves to weather hard times. And this is basically very similar to a bacterial endospore in terms of function, at least. It may not look exactly like an endospore. Okay? It's structurally different, but the concept and the goal of forming a cyst or an endospore is the same. It's to weather bad environmental conditions. Now, protozoa primarily reproduce asexually, meaning they do not have to have a partner in order to reproduce, but sometimes in some species they can exchange DNA with another cell, and this is called conjugation. So it's like a type of sexual reproduction. Now, there are lots of different phyla or groups of protozoa, and the primary means by which we identify or divide up the protozoa is to look at their style of locomotion. So, for example, if we look at this amoeba here, its way of moving around is to form what are called pseudopods, which means false foot. And they use that salt's foot to extend their cells out in different directions. Here's a pseudopod here, here's another one here, here's another one. And then the rest of the body follows. Once an arm reaches out in a particular direction, then all of the cytoplasm in the cell streams into that pseudopod and moves forward. I'll try to remember to put some perhaps little videos of some of these different ways of moving among protozoa up on the website, the course website for you all. Another phylum based on a different form of locomotion, the group that amoebas fall into is called the Sarcodyna, phylum Sarcodyna. Phylum Mastigophora is the phylum in which protozoa with flagella are found. And an example of that would be a euglena cell. The phylum Ciliophora are cells that are surrounded by those short little, almost look like hair-like projections called cilia. A good example of that are paramecia. They are in the phylum Ciliophora, and they use their cilia to move around. And then there's a group of, or a phylum of protozoa that do not move on their own, and they fall into a category called apicomplexa. Apicomplexa. And one example of this is Plasmodium, with a causative agent of malaria. It actually moves about by being transported by a mosquito and then injected into a human host, where it first moves to the liver and then eventually it goes into the blood to reproduce. Some pathogenic examples of these protozoa include what I just talked about, the causative agent of malaria. It can include things like, if you've ever heard of, oh shoot, the name just went out of my head. It's a waterborne sickness. It'll come to me in just a second. Giardia, that was it. Giardia, right there, which is found in water. There are lots of other kinds of ones. We talked about malaria already. And I'm not going to go into too much detail of this. You can get infections with amoeba from water and from food. And some of these are more serious than others. But these are just a couple of them that I'm going to mention. So those are some pathogenic examples, and your book has more if you want to read in detail about them, although some of them we will talk about in more detail towards the end of the semester. Last group that we are only going to very briefly talk about are the helminths. And the helminths are multicellular. They're in the kingdom Animalia. They too are heterotrophs, meaning they have to get their food from somewhere else. It turns out they usually get food from a host because they are, for the most part, parasitic. So they have to rely on a host in order to get food. Examples of pathogenic members of the helminths include tapeworms that some people, tapeworms that some people get in their intestinal tract. Here's an example of a tapeworm here, and they can be up to 2, 3, or 4 meters long. Trematodes that can also cause infection problems. Those are both types of flatworms as opposed to roundworms like you see up here, which can lead to other types of infections. And again, we're not going to go into too much detail in terms of different types of pathogens. Mostly the goal of this review of eukaryotes is just to give you an idea what are the different kingdoms and what are some of the general characteristics of each of those eukaryotic kingdoms. And that's the end of our lecture on eukaryotes. Make sure you've carefully read through the appropriate chapter in your book on this. Remember that the lecture is to help summarize information from the book, but not to serve as a replacement for reading the chapter. You still need to do that.